This is Politics UK. I'm Charlotte Wright. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh and Cardiff and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Alicia McCarthy. On the programme this week, a senior Conservative MP calls on the party to replace the Prime Minister.
Was he surprised to see one of his own MPs say that he doesn't get what Britain needs and he's not listening to what people want?
This from a man who takes the knee, Mr. Speaker, who wanted to abolish the monarchy, who still doesn't know what a woman is.
The UK joins the US in fresh airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. But how long will this military action last?
In order to protect civilian shipping, this may need to be a prolonged and persistent targeted campaign alongside our allies.
Should we be getting more fossil fuels out of the North Sea?
We do not live in a world where we can simply turn off oil and gas.
We really shouldn't need any more wake-up calls to put aside the distractions and act with the urgency the situation demands.
And can anything be done to save the jobs of steelworkers in South Wales?
This government is not signed up to the company's plan. We believe that there is a credible alternative that would sustain jobs at Port Talbot.
Well, let's start here in Westminster with Alicia. And Alicia, we heard a dramatic intervention from a Conservative MP, from a former Cabinet Minister this week, calling for the Prime Minister to be replaced. I guess it wasn't a huge surprise then that Keir Starmer chose to raise this at Prime Minister's Questions this week.
No, it certainly wasn't. I mean, normally on a Wednesday morning, we political nerds like to play a little guessing game to try to work out what it is that Sir Keir Starmer might choose to go on to try to skewer the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's Questions. But no need for that this week. And that was because Sir Simon Clarke, former Cabinet Minister, had written this rather brutal article in the Daily Telegraph, which had been published the night before. Now, in it, essentially, he said that the parliamentary party, should give Rishi Sunak the push and they should replace him with someone who was rather more robust when it came to subjects like tax and immigration. He predicted that the party was facing something of a massacre at the polls and said that there needed to be a change because Rishi Sunak did not get what Britain needed. Now, that was all pretty quickly slapped down by some very senior Conservatives. But as you say, not really any surprise when it came to Prime Minister's Questions. Keir Starmer did challenge the Prime Minister on some policy points on job losses in the steel industry and on the suggestion that some parents in England might not get access to some extra free childcare that they'd been promised. But no surprise at all, really, that he did start with that attack by Sir Simon Clarke on Rishi Sunak.
Was he surprised to see one of his own MPs say that he doesn't get what Britain needs and he's not listening to what people want?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about what Britain needs, what Britain wants, what Britain values. This from a man who takes the knee, Mr. Speaker, who wanted to abolish the monarchy, who still doesn't know what a woman is, and who just this week, one of his front benchers said that they back teaching divisive white privilege in our schools, Mr. Speaker. Looking at his record, it's crystal clear which one of us doesn't get Britain's values.
Mr. Speaker, he spouts so much nonsense, no wonder they're giving up on him. And even now, as his government crumbles around him and his own MPs point out he's out of touch, got no plan for growth, crime or building houses, the Prime Minister is sticking to his one-man Pollyanna show. Everything's fine. People should be grateful to him. The trouble is, no one's buying it. Does he actually understand why his own MPs say he doesn't understand Britain and that he is an obstacle to recovery?
Prime Minister.
Again, Mr. Speaker, He calls it nonsense, but these are his positions, Mr. Speaker. Right? And he doesn't want to talk about it, but this is the fact. He chose to represent a now proscribed terrorist group, Mr. Speaker. He chose to campaign against the deportation of foreign national offenders, Mr. Speaker, just like he chose to serve the Right Honourable Member for Islington North, Mr. Speaker. That's his record, those are his values, and that is exactly how he should be judged.
Mr. Speaker, in 2008, I was the Director of Public Prosecution, putting terrorists and murderers in jail. He was making millions betting on the misery of working people during the financial crisis. And we've seen this story time and time again with this lot. Party first, country second, safely ensconced in Westminster, they get down to the real business of fighting each other to death. The country forced to endure their division and chaos, the longest episode of EastEnders ever put to film. Meanwhile, this week we discover that Britain is going to be the only major economy that no longer makes its own steel. That the government is handing out £500 million to make 3,000 steelworkers redundant. And that the parents of thousands are being told that his free childcare promise is nothing but a mirage. Isn't he embarrassed that the Tory party is yet again entirely focused on itself?
Even his own party are now realising that he simply doesn't have a plan for this country, Mr. Speaker. The member for Dagenham and Rain has said it's difficult to identify the purpose of his leadership. And long-time celebrity backer Steve Coogan recently said he licks his finger, sticks it in the air, and just sees which way the wind is blowing. Even Labour Party know, Mr. Speaker, he's not a leader, he is a human weather vane.
Well, that was a lively Prime Minister's questions there, wasn't it? Now, earlier in the week, the UK, along with the United States, carried out a fresh wave of airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. And MPs got a chance to question the Prime Minister about that.
Yeah, that's right. So this was the news that for the second time, as you say, the UK had joined with the US to attack the Houthis, who are based in Yemen. Now, the Houthis are a rebel group. They're backed by Iran and they're opposed to Israel. So what they've been doing is they've been attacking ships which they say are either Israeli-owned or are heading to Israel, although actually in reality, that isn't really the case. Now, the US and the UK say that military vessels in the Red Sea and what is really a vital global international shipping route need to be protected. So they launched some attacks previously on the 11th of January against the Houthis to try to degrade, is the term that they use, to try to degrade their capability to launch these attacks. But the Houthis have carried on attacking vessels, and so there was a second round of strikes on Monday night, and the next day the Prime Minister came to the Commons to talk to MPs about it.
At my order overnight, the RAF engaged in a second wave of strikes against Houthi military targets in Yemen. We did so because we continue to see, including in intelligence, an ongoing and imminent threat from the Houthis to UK commercial and military vessels and to those of our partners in the Red Sea and wider region. I told the House last week that we would not hesitate to respond if the acts continue in order to protect innocent lives and preserve the freedom of navigation. And that is what we have done. We acted alongside the United States with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands. We acted on the same basis as the 11th of January, fully in line with international law, in self-defence, and in response to a persistent threat. And Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear. We are not seeking a confrontation. We urge the Houthis and those who enable them to stop these illegal and unacceptable attacks. But if necessary, the United Kingdom will not hesitate to respond again in self-defence.
Labour said we will judge further action on the Houthis on a case-by-case basis. So let me be clear, we back this targeted action to reinforce maritime security in the Red Sea. The Houthi attacks must stop. They are designed to destabilise us, so we must stand united and strong. They bring danger to ordinary civilians working hard at sea, so we must protect them. And they aim to disrupt the flow of goods, food and medicines. so we must not let them go unaddressed. So while we do not question the justification for action, it is right that the House hears more about their effectiveness. Labour, of course, recognises that strikes can be used to reduce threat without eliminating it, and we recognise that the military action taken is just one component of a wider diplomatic strategy. But nonetheless, I would ask the Prime Minister to set out his confidence that these strikes will be effective in reducing Houthi capabilities.
The strikes last week were effective in degrading capability, and all the intended targets were destroyed. And I'm also pleased to say that our initial evidence from last night's strikes is also that all intended targets were destroyed.
Can I welcome what my right honourable friend says about diplomatic and humanitarian efforts and indeed cutting off the supply of arms? I particularly welcome what he says about the effectiveness of the strikes that have already taken place. But would he, however, agree that in order to protect civilian shipping, this may need to be a prolonged and persistent targeted campaign alongside our allies?
I just want to be absolutely clear that no decision has been taken to embark on a sustained campaign of the nature that he mentioned. These were limited strikes specifically in response to threats that we perceived.
The Houthis have been under constant, almost constant, bombardment from Saudi Arabia for the best part of 8 years. They didn't get that message, so why are we so confident that they will get our message this time around? And that, of course, leads to the wider question of what is the ultimate strategy here going forward.
As difficult as the situation is, to do nothing would also be a choice. And I believe it would be the wrong choice, because it would be tantamount to ceding control of a global shipping route which is economically vital to a dangerous militant group which is backed by Iran and putting innocent lives at risk.
As I made clear last week, the Liberal Democrats accept the case for limited strikes against the Houthis as long as they remain limited. But will he not give the House the opportunity to vote on this matter, not least given the huge cross-party support there are for limited strikes, which will surely strengthen the signal that he intends to give?
We reserve the right to take action in a limited, proportionate and legal way in self-defence. That's the right thing, and I think the country would expect nothing less from the government.
Can the Prime Minister tell us where this will end, since the only message, whether he likes it or not, actually being received in the region is the UK's failure to back an end to the suffering in Gaza?
Prime Minister.
Again, I urge the Honourable Lady not to link and conflate these two things, because, no, she's right. It is the Houthis that are doing that, and it's right that we call that out as being wrong, as the government of Yemen themselves have done so. It is absolutely right that we take necessary proportionate action in self-defence against risk to British lives and interests. That's what we did last week. That's what we have done this week, and we will always reserve the right to do so. And in parallel and separately, we're also doing everything we can to bring about more aid into Gaza and a sustainable ceasefire there that involves a release of hostages and the end of Hamas's hostilities.
Well, we heard Sir Ed Davey there, the leader of the Lib Dems, saying that Parliament should get a vote on these airstrikes. The Prime Minister rejected that idea. What do you make of that debate?
Yeah, the Prime Minister can act without parliamentary approval, but there has been something of a convention since the Iraq War, basically, in the early 2000s, that MPs are consulted. But as is always the way with Parliament, it's a tiny bit more complicated than that. So it does depend rather on whether the action is offensive or defensive as to whether you seek approval before or after the event. And one final point, let's not forget that David Cameron did consult Parliament before he wanted to launch strikes on Syria. And that was rejected by MPs. They voted against it. And Theresa May in 2018, when she launched action against Syria, although she did come to the Commons and she did make a statement, there wasn't a vote.
Really interesting looking back at some of the history there. Thank you so much, Alicia. We'll catch up again with you later. Let's go to Holyrood now, though, and we can talk to our reporter, Jenny Davidson. Thanks for joining us, Jenny. The UK COVID inquiry is currently in Edinburgh to hear about evidence about how the Scottish Government handled the pandemic. And there's been a lot of talk about WhatsApp messages, both at the inquiry and in the Scottish Parliament.
That's right, yes. The UK COVID inquiry is here for 3 weeks taking evidence. And this week we've been hearing from some senior officials in the Scottish Government, the Chief Medical Officer, Gregor Smith, National Clinical Director, Jason Leach, and also the former Director General for Strategy, Ken Thompson. And a lot of focus has been on some chats on WhatsApp, some comments by them that suggested they were perhaps quite enthusiastic about making sure that WhatsApp messages were deleted, reminders to delete WhatsApp conversations regularly, reminders that conversations on WhatsApp could be subject to freedom of information requests, and a comment by Jason Leach that deleting WhatsApps was a pre-bed ritual for him, although he later told the inquiry that was a flippant exaggeration in an informal chat. But questions about this from the inquiry itself, and questions also at Holyrood from the opposition.
Ken Thompson, the man who drafted the Scottish Government's records management policy, was advising people how to avoid complying with it. The National Clinical Director, Jason Leach, who helped shape the COVID regulations, was advising the current First Minister how to avoid the rules. And Nicola Sturgeon, who promised transparency, has alongside John Swinney and senior civil servants deleted WhatsApp messages on an industrial scale. No lessons learnt there, Deputy First Minister. So whether messages were deleted nightly or weekly, it is clear that Jason Leach wiped his messages completely and seemed to find the period during the pandemic all quite funny, judging from the messages we have seen. This isn't just a matter for the inquiry, it's a matter for the Scottish Government too. So if the Scottish Government agrees that Jason Leach's behaviour was inappropriate, is it not time that he was sacked?
Look, Jason Leach isn't here to defend himself, as Jackie Baillie knows, and I don't think it's fair to focus in this chamber on any individual. The inquiry is the place that should be allowed to interrogate anyone, whether it's Jason Leach or whether it's the former First Minister, who of course will give evidence, as will the current First Minister. It should be for the inquiry to be able to interrogate the evidence, whether that's on messages or decision-making or anything else. In terms of the issue of the frequency of deletion, it's actually not about the frequency of deletion of messages, but rather the importance of capturing any relevant information in line with records management policies.
Now, as we heard there, it was the Scottish Government's official policy that people should regularly delete WhatsApp messages once the important points about decisions were transferred into official records. Jason Leach said he believed he was following the policy correctly, but it has raised these questions about who decides what are the important points to the record and what are you missing by not having those behind-the-scenes discussions about decisions.
And then at First Minister's questions, these issues were picked up by the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross, weren't they?
Yes, both the Scottish Conservatives and Scottish Labour asking questions again about WhatsApps at First Minister's questions. Particular focus from Douglas Ross on Nicola Sturgeon, who's also deleted her WhatsApp messages according to that policy. And he was raising questions about transparency, suggesting there might be a culture of secrecy that goes right to the top of government. Humza Yousaf denying that, pointing to 28,000 messages that have been handed over to the inquiry, pointing to those daily briefings where the First Minister answered questions. But he did admit that it wasn't the Scottish Government's finest hour. Questions then turned to evidence that were given to the inquiry, just before First Minister's questions from Nicola Sturgeon's Chief of Staff, Liz Lloyd, that suggested there might be some sort of political motivation for some decisions and perhaps stirring up differences with the UK Government.
Nicola Sturgeon's Chief of Staff talks of making, and I quote, purely political moves on public health to start a good old-fashioned rammy with the UK Government. In another handwritten note, she says she is going to look at political tactics, calling for things we can't do. Hiding revelations like this must have been the reason that the SNP government destroyed so much evidence. The First Minister, the Deputy First Minister, the National Clinical Director, the Chief Medical Officer all deleted their messages. Discussions and crucial decisions have vanished. A top-down culture of secrecy was rife throughout this entire government. It looks like the most senior figures have engaged in a deliberate cover-up.
I reject the charge in its entirety, Presiding Officer. We had, of course, and published regularly the approach in relation to the four harms approach that we took in regards to decisions that were made in relation to the pandemic. And every single day, I can say with confidence that our overarching priority was always to keep the people of this country safe. That was what the overarching priority was.
Mr. Ross.
That was the overarching priority. Did we get every decision right? Absolutely not. And we will be rightly questioned about that in both the UK inquiry and the Scottish inquiry.
Now, Humza Yousaf promised truthful answers to street questions when he gave evidence to the inquiry on Thursday afternoon. He also announced an externally led review of the Scottish Government's WhatsApp use. As well as that, we've got Nicola Sturgeon, of course, appearing, we expect, before the inquiry next week. So lots more on this to come.
Yes, sounds like lots more to come. Separately, Holyrood Committee has been looking at ways to improve the criminal justice system for victims of sexual offences. What are the ideas that they're considering?
Yes, that's right. This is proposals within the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill, quite wide-ranging justice reform proposals, including getting rid of Scotland's third verdict if not proven, changing the size and majority of juries, setting up specialist sexual offences courts, and perhaps running a pilot of judge-only rape trials without juries. Now, lots of consensus that the system as it is isn't great for victims of sexual crimes and that there's room for improvement. Less consensus about what that room for improvement should be and whether it involves new legislation. One of the things we heard about was questions around whether the Specialist Sexual Offences Court would really be effective if it wasn't going to involve new specialist separate buildings for the court.
I'm just interested in teasing out a little bit more about the key elements, if you like, in a specialist approach to dealing with sexual offences and rape cases.
The difficulty is we have a court estate which is old-fashioned. I'm not sure how many of you have had experience in the courts. I've been in quite a few across Scotland over the years, and it's fair to say they're not modern. They don't look like this building. I suspect that in itself is intimidating. I suspect things like, you know, the language we use, the legal language, which has been part of our system for hundreds of years. That is all of those things, the wigs, the gowns, there are all sorts of debates around these things, that all of those contribute. So specialisation of itself may not assist in that task, I think, we hope to achieve of improving the experience for victims and survivors.
Now, the most controversial part of this bill is that idea of piloting judge-only rape trials. It's something the legal profession has come out quite strongly against. But the committee also heard that it would be very difficult to run a pilot like that for some time because of all the other changes that are proposed within this bill. There wouldn't be a baseline for comparison for some years to come.
OK, thank you, Jenny. Thanks for the update. That's Jenny Davidson in Holyrood there. Let's return to Westminster now with Alicia. And Alicia, we know the government wants to get more oil and gas out of the North Sea. MPs were debating that plan this week, weren't they?
They were. This is the Offshore Petroleum Licensing Bill, to give it its proper name. And basically it says that the regulator will have to grant annual licences for oil and gas. Now, it does already do this, and it does tend to do it on a broadly annual basis. So what's all the fuss about? Well, in essence, it's about boosting production, and it comes at a time when we're supposed to be trying to cut our carbon emissions. Now, A couple of weeks ago, the former Conservative minister who was in charge of net zero policy, Chris Skidmore, actually resigned as an MP over this whole issue, saying that it was a shame the UK was losing its leadership on climate change. And Sir Alok Sharma, who you'll remember is the Conservative, who chaired that big climate conference up in Glasgow a couple of years ago, he's also said that the UK shouldn't need any more wake-up calls about the dangers of carbon emissions after the recent flooding and storms that we've had. But the government says it will improve UK independence, it will reduce the amount of imports that we have to have, and it will protect UK jobs in the industry. And when she was in the Commons, the Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, defended the government's policy.
When we reach net zero in 2050, we'll still be using oil and gas for a significant portion of our energy. And that's because it is not absolute zero, it is net zero. Yeah. In other words, while our use of oil and gas is going to rapidly diminish, we will still need both for decades to come. Our bill will improve our energy security and the energy security of Europe. In the last 2 years, Europe has had to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. We have responded by tripling gas export to the continent, and we were a net exporter of electricity to Europe in 2022 for the first time in more than a decade. We do not live in a world where we can simply turn off oil and gas.
Here are the facts. The UK's North Sea gas production, with new licences, is set to fall by 95% by 2050. And without new licences, by 97%. Right. So that is the equivalent of 4 days of our current gas demand. So all of this absolute codswallop about the idea that this is guaranteeing our energy security, that this is somehow going to guarantee these 200,000 jobs, it's just risible nonsense.
Sadly, what this bill does do, and this is my opinion, and others will have theirs, it does do is to reinforce the unfortunate perception about the UK rowing back from climate action, as indeed we saw last autumn with the chopping and changing of some policies. And it does make our international partners question the seriousness with which we take our international commitments. We've seen the impacts of the changing climate around us daily. 2023 was the hottest year on record globally. In recent weeks, many people have faced flooding again in our country, including in my own constituency. We really shouldn't need any more wake-up calls to put aside the distractions and act with the urgency the situation demands.
What we need from the government is a bold plan to further accelerate the electrification from renewables of our domestic energy market. What we are presented with is a backward-looking cash grab for Scotland's hydrocarbons, which comes at the cost of the just transition. Scotland will lose out by having our energy policy dictated by a Luddite and remote Westminster government focused relentlessly on the rear-view mirror rather than on the future.
The oil and gas sector in Scotland and across the UK is absolutely essential to delivering and achieving net zero. The investment in green energy infrastructure that will allow us to build our renewables capacity is coming from the revenue from oil and gas extraction. The businesses that are looking to expand offshore wind and the wind farms for tomorrow are staying solvent today because of their revenues from North Sea oil and gas. And the skills and expertise that we have heard throughout this debate so far today that will be required to support our offshore renewables going forward currently work in our oil and gas sector today.
Of course, any oil and gas which is extracted will be owned by companies and sold on the international market to the highest bidder. Unless, of course, the government, unbeknownst to us, actually has in mind the renationalisation of energy, which would be a very interesting conversation to have. But when I last checked, that wasn't their policy. This oil and gas in the North Sea does not belong to the government, and it will not bring down bills.
That's Caroline Lucas, the Green MP there. Now, viewers of this programme will know that the power-sharing government of Northern Ireland has been suspended for a very long time, almost 2 years now. And that's over a row over post-Brexit trading rules in Northern Ireland. The UK government are passing a law about this, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. As you say, regular viewers will know that while we talk to our colleagues in the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments every week, we don't talk to our colleagues in Northern Ireland. And that's because there has been no executive or assembly there for coming up for 2 years. The Democratic Unionist Party pulled the plug on power sharing in protest at the post-Brexit trade deal rules. So the absence of devolved government should really lead to fresh elections. But what the government has decided to do is to introduce this bill, and it extends the deadline for forming an executive, in essence to give the DUP a bit more time to see if they want to try to return to Stormont. Now, when that bill to extend the deadline was debated in the Commons, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, revealed that he'd faced threats over his efforts to try to reach a deal to restore power sharing in Northern Ireland.
I am a proud unionist. I am proud to be part of this United Kingdom. I am proud to have served my country in this Parliament for almost 27 years. I'm proud of the service that I've given, unlike some others, to my country when I put on the uniform of the Ulster Defence Regiment to protect everyone in the community from terrorism and violence. And yet today, because of the stirring up that is going on, I was threatened. Threatened by those who never put on a uniform, by those who haven't served our country. And when I checked out, one of the people who threatened me on the register didn't vote at the last election. Can't even come out to vote for our future in the Union, never mind do anything about it. And yet they're threatening people like me, who's working day and night to try and find solutions and to move Northern Ireland forward on a basis that the vast majority of people can support.
There is no perfect solution to the challenges that Brexit poses to Northern Ireland. The Windsor Framework, I think, does perhaps offer the best approach to putting a square peg into a round hole, short of a wider reassessment of the overall UK relationship with the European Union. But I have to stress that whatever the residual issues that exist in terms of the Windsor Framework, and I do fully accept that businesses have frustrations with certain aspects of what they are seeing, and the same applies for consumers in some respects. All of those pale into insignificance from the absence of not having functioning institutions and the ability to take decisions around health, education, our economy and protecting our environment.
People in Northern Ireland now feel like the default setting is to have no government. That just isn't good enough. And any of us in this place who really believes in devolution, who've really put their shoulder to the wheel around this peace process, need to ensure that we can very soon have democratically elected politicians in Northern Ireland dealing with these issues. Because I do find it, frankly, embarrassing at the state of our health service. I was reading some figures the other day about dementia diagnosis. Some people in the western part of Northern Ireland are waiting almost 6 years to get diagnosed with dementia. In what modern democracy should that be seen as acceptable? I mean, we are very lucky that people aren't on the streets in uproar at those kind of figures.
MPs there discussing power sharing in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much for now, Alicia. We'll come back to you, but let's go to Cardiff now. We can speak to our reporter, Teleri Glyn-Jones. Teleri, we saw Keir Starmer questioning Rishi Sunak earlier about Tata Steel's plans to close both their blast furnaces in Port Talbot, with the loss of nearly 3,000 jobs. And as you'd expect, that's been a big focus for members of the Welsh Parliament this week too.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't totally unexpected news, but it was the worst case scenario. The unions favoured an alternative plan which would see only one of the blast furnaces close while the company transitioned to an electric arc furnace, which is greener but requires far fewer workers. It's not in the end what the company went for, and the UK government say that this is a good deal considering Tata was considering closing the plant altogether, with a loss of 17,500 jobs in the wider local economy. But in plenary, we saw the leader of the Welsh Conservatives in the Senedd, Andrew R.T. Davies, in a rare departure from his UK colleagues, reveal that he actually didn't agree with the UK government's stance on that.
It's devastating news, I think, for the whole of the United Kingdom, because there will be no indigenous steelmaking capacity in the United Kingdom if the company's plans go ahead. So this government is not signed up to the company's plan. We believe that there is a credible alternative that would sustain jobs at Port Talbot and would sustain indigenous steelmaking in the United Kingdom.
I can understand you obviously outlining where you think things should go, but ultimately we have before us an announcement for the company that is going to shut, regrettably, the 2 blast furnaces in Port Talbot. I disagree with that proposal. From the conversations I've had with Tata, I was always under the impression that at least one of those blast furnaces would continue in operation. And I still maintain that that is a feasible objective for the transition to arc furnaces.
Mark Drakeford later went on to ask Tata Steel not to make any irreversible decisions because a future UK Labour government would show far more commitment to the industry than the current Conservative administration, with an offer of £3 billion for a green steel plan on the table.
And it's interesting, isn't it? We heard the First Minister there saying that this news is devastating for the whole UK because of what it'll mean for the country's ability to produce steel.
Yes, that is a huge concern for everyone involved. The UK government struck a deal with Tata back in September that saw them invest £500 million in the company for them to build this electric arc furnace, as well as £100 million for a transition board alongside the Welsh government to help the affected workers retrain. Labour have criticised them for not attaching any strings to that deal to avoid this cliff edge for jobs that we're seeing now. But Plaid Cymru have gone even further, saying that it simply doesn't match up to the scale of the challenge, and Labour's plan wouldn't be enough either.
I want to make it clear I don't think £3 billion is near enough either. It's better than the £500 million that's on the table from the current government. But the UK government just isn't investing to help heavy industry prepare for a just transition to a cleaner future like governments in other European countries do. And there are subsidies of €50 billion available to help energy-intensive manufacturers in Germany transition to climate-neutral technologies. €2.6 billion is being invested in one region alone in decarbonising its steel industry with hydrogen. We have to be setting the bar so much higher.
I wrote immediately to the Prime Minister asking for a telephone call with him on Friday so that we could jointly discuss how we could best respond to the emerging picture. And by 8 o'clock, 8:30 in the morning on Friday, I'd had a reply from the Prime Minister saying that he couldn't find time to meet me or talk to me that day. And I do think that is genuinely shocking.
Now, that political row between the Welsh and UK government over who called who when and who was at the table and was allowed to be involved in the talks with Tata Steel erupted probably quite predictably over the last few days. But the truth is they will both governments will have to learn to work together, particularly on that transition board, if they're going to make the best of this awful situation and help those workers retrain.
OK. We also got this week the Welsh Government's plan to tackle child poverty. What's the reaction been to that?
Yes, it goes without saying, of course, that no government wants to see child poverty in their country. But here in Wales, there's history there. It's been a main priority for the Labour Welsh administration here since the beginning of devolution. Targets to eradicate it were scrapped in 2016. Mark Drakeford made it an absolute priority of his campaign when he was elected leader of Welsh Labour 5 years ago now. But the dial has hardly moved in that time. Still, 1 in 3 children in Wales live in poverty, and this new, long-awaited strategy without any clear targets or ways of measuring it has been roundly criticised by the third sector.
Objective 1 is to reduce costs and maximise the income of families. And this must be first and foremost in our approach to tackling poverty and supporting those experiencing poverty. Free school meals, the Schools Essential Grant updated school uniform guidance, education and maintenance allowance increased from £30 to £40, free prescriptions, free period products, and our partnership with the Fuel Bank Foundation, all examples of work already underway to deliver on this objective.
This Welsh Government strategy does not include any measurable targets, instead using the generic national milestones within the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act and a so-called monitoring and impact framework. How do you therefore respond to the statement today by Bernardo's Cymru that it continues to be a disappointment that Welsh Government has not listened to numerous recommendations on the need for targets and an action plan attached to the strategy so that progress can be transparently and regularly monitored?
Now, the strongest criticism of the strategy came from Wales's Children's Commissioner, Rocio Cifuentes, who said it was deeply disappointing that even after such strong arguments were made in the consultation that no targets were in the plan. But the Welsh Government's response is that it's very difficult to have meaningful targets without the powers over social security that would allow them to reach those targets.
OK, Teleri Glyn-Jones at Cardiff Bay, thanks so much for bringing us up to date. Let's return to Westminster now and catch up with Alicia. And there was lots of talk about the Rwanda bill in the Commons last week, wasn't there, as it passed through to the next stage. It's in the Lords now, and peers had a chance to express their view on it this week.
Yes, that's right. So this is Rishi Sunak's plan to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda to have their claims processed there. Now, in an unprecedented move, peers voted by a majority of 43 to delay the ratification of the Rwanda Treaty. And this is the agreement that underpins the government's proposals. Now, a couple of quick points here. This vote isn't binding on the government, and we are talking here about the treaty and not the Rwanda bill. So, quick recap. The treaty basically has been signed between the UK and Rwanda, and it beefs up the asylum process in Rwanda and says that people who are sent there won't be sent to other countries where they may be under threat. That was one of the big concerns of the UK Supreme Court. The bill itself is the bit that declares Rwanda to be safe. Now, what peers were saying on Monday is that the treaty shouldn't be ratified until the government is able to prove that Rwanda is safe. And one of the peers who opposes what the government's trying to do suggested that the peers were right to flex their muscles.
Before all the lectures about unelected second houses, etc., I do think on matters of the rule of law, your lordships have a part to play. Noble lords are entitled to be a little more muscular than usual in relation to matters such as this that were, my lords, not in anyone's manifesto, that risk being contrary to the domestic rule of law, including by ousting the jurisdiction of the courts, or indeed changing reality, as it has been found by the Supreme Court on the 15th of November.
The whole reason for the proposals to send people to Rwanda was because it was going to be such a hellhole that nobody would want to get on a boat if they thought they were going to go to Rwanda. But of course, the dilemma that the government now faces is because of the Supreme Court, they have to demonstrate what a wonderful, safe place Rwanda is. And I do wonder whether that might just be a moment for them to reflect on the purpose of their policy.
Last week, the Prime Minister urged the opposition in the House of Lords to get on board and do the right thing to stop the boats. You have a choice tonight: push this amendment to try to obstruct an effective deterrent, or back down and let this treaty pass like every time this procedure has been used before. I offer thanks again to all who participated. We must stop the boats. We must put an end to this mass trafficking of people and save lives. That is the humane thing to do, and it is the fair thing to do, and that is what we remain absolutely committed to delivering, this partnership without delay.
And we'll be hearing more on the Rwanda bill next week.
We will. The bill itself is in the Lords. It's at a stage called second reading, which is basically the first chance that the Lords have to have a really big debate on the contents of the bill. Now, normally peers don't kill off bills at this stage, but there is an amendment down from the Liberal Democrats who do want to try to kill off the bill, and they're going to put that forward on Monday. So could make for a very interesting late night on Monday.
Certainly one to watch. All right, thank you so much, Alicia. That's all we've got time for on Politics UK this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer. In the meantime, have a great weekend.